The wind howled across the sprawling plains of Montana, a mournful sound that seemed to echo the emptiness in Cal Blackwood's heart. It had been 3 years since Ilara's death, and the vast, sun-scorched lands of the Blackwood Canyon Ranch were a constant, aching reminder of what he had lost. The ranch was a monument to his grief, its grand house a hollow shell where laughter and light had once lived. Cal, now a man carved from sorrow and silence, spent his days on horseback, the dust of the trail his only companion. His rugged face, once quick to a smile, was now a mask of weary resolve, his eyes a distant, haunted blue. He rode toward the main corral, the rhythm of his horse's hooves a steady, dull beat against the silence. Silas, his loyal foreman, was already there, mending a fence post with the quiet efficiency of a man who knew his place and his purpose. Silas was an old hand, with a face weathered by sun and time, and a quiet strength that had held the ranch together when Cal could not. He didn't speak much, but his presence was a constant, solid comfort. "Morning, Cal," Silas said, without looking up from his work. "Got a couple of strays to round up on the South Ridge. Thought I'd take a few boys out there after lunch." Cal grunted in response, a non-committal sound. His mind was elsewhere, lost in a memory of Ilara's laugh as she'd once raced him to that very corral, her vibrant red hair a flash of fire against the blue sky. The memory was a sharp shard of glass in his gut, a pain he had come to accept as a part of his existence. He dismounted, the creak of the leather saddle a familiar sound. He ran a calloused hand over the splintered wood of the fence, a distraction from the ache. "I'll go with you," Cal finally said, his voice a low rasp from disuse. He needed the physical exhaustion, the sharp sting of the sun, anything to numb the gnawing emptiness. Silas looked up then, a hint of concern in his eyes. "You sure, boss? You've been pushing yourself hard." "I'm fine," Cal snapped, the words coming out sharper than he intended. He regretted it instantly. Silas was the closest thing he had to family now, and he had no right to be short with him. "Just want to get it done." Silas nodded, understanding. He didn't push. He never did. He just turned back to his work, the rhythmic hammering of his hammer a testament to his patience. As the sun climbed higher, casting long shadows across the dusty ground, a lone rider appeared on the horizon. The sight was unusual. The Blackwood Canyon Ranch was isolated, far from the main trails. As the rider drew closer, Cal's brow furrowed. It was a woman, and she looked old, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She was riding a weary-looking mare, its coat matted with dust. Cal felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in a long time: annoyance. He wasn't in the mood for visitors, for small talk, for anything that might disrupt the carefully constructed wall of solitude he had built around himself. The woman reined in her horse a few feet from the corral fence. Her face was etched with a lifetime of sorrow, her grey hair pulled back in a simple, tight bun, but it was her eyes that caught Cal's attention. They were a vivid, startling shade of green, and as they met his, a jolt of recognition, both painful and immediate, shot through him. He saw Ilara in them. He saw the very same light, dimmed now by time and suffering, that had once lit up his world. A tremor ran through him. His jaw tightened. He knew who she was. He had met her only once, at Ilara's funeral. Penelope Penny Sterling, Ilara's mother. A wave of guilt, thick and suffocating, washed over him. He was the reason she was here. He hadn't protected Ilara. He hadn't been there when she needed him most. He had failed her. Penny dismounted with a wince of pain, her movements slow and deliberate. She looked up at him, her gaze unwavering. "Caleb," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. It was a sound full of a different kind of grief, one that mirrored his own but was tinged with a fragile hope he hadn't possessed in years. Cal couldn't speak. He just stood there, rooted to the spot, a statue of stone and regret. She started, her voice breaking. She looked around the ranch, her eyes lingering on the porch swing where Ilara and she had once sat, talking for hours. "I need a place to stay, just for one night." The words hung in the air, a simple request that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken burdens. Cal looked at her, at the raw vulnerability in her face, and for the first time in years, the wall he had built around his heart began to crack. The memory of Ilara's face, her beautiful smile, flashed in his mind. He couldn't refuse her. Not her. "Come inside," he said, his voice gruff. "The house is quiet." Penny nodded, a small, grateful smile touching her lips. As she turned to follow him, her hand unconsciously went to her side, a fleeting gesture of pain that didn't escape Cal's notice. She was fragile, bruised by life, but there was a resilience in her that reminded him of Ilara. He led her toward the house, a stranger from his past walking into his present, threatening to shatter the careful isolation he had cultivated. The shadow in his heart had just found a new and unexpected shape. The inside of the Blackwood house was a mausoleum of memories. Dust motes danced in the slivers of sunlight that pierced the drawn curtains, illuminating the stillness. A faint, lingering scent of lavender and old paper clung to the air, a ghost of Ilara's presence. Cal hadn't changed a thing. Her books were still on the shelf. A half-finished embroidery project lay on a small table by the window, and a single, wilted rose sat in a vase on the mantelpiece. Penny walked through the parlor, her hand trailing over the back of a plush armchair. Her fingers brushed against the fabric, a silent communion with a life that was no longer there. Cal watched her, a knot of guilt tightening in his stomach. This house, this life, was supposed to have been hers and Ilara's. He had promised her that. He had failed. "It's just as I remember," Penny said softly, her voice thick with emotion. She turned to him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "She loved this house, Caleb. She loved you." The words were a dagger to his heart. He flinched, turning away from her gaze. I'll get you a room ready," he mumbled, his voice a low growl. "Upstairs." He walked away, needing to escape the suffocating weight of her presence, of her grief, which felt so much purer and less selfish than his own. He went to the kitchen, a place he only ever entered to make coffee, and put a kettle on the stove. The rhythmic clatter of the tin kettle on the burner was a small grounding sound in the silence. When he returned to the parlor, Penny had settled into a chair, her shoulders slumped with exhaustion. Her hand was pressed against her ribs, and a faint groan escaped her lips. "Are you hurt?" Cal asked, his voice laced with a concern he hadn't known he still possessed. Penny looked up, her expression a mix of pain and defiance. "It's nothing, just a fall from the horse." She waved a dismissive hand, but her face was pale. Cal didn't believe her. He went to her side and knelt, his gaze fixed on her pale, trembling hands. "Let me see." She hesitated, but then with a sigh of surrender she pulled her hand away. There was a dark, purplish bruise spreading across her ribs. It looked deep and painful. "It's worse than I thought," she admitted, her voice barely a whisper. "The fall. It was a few days ago. I kept going, but it hurts to breathe." A wave of protectiveness, as fierce as it was unexpected, washed over Cal. This was Ilara's mother, the woman who had given him the most precious thing in his life. He would not let her suffer. "You're not leaving tonight," he stated, his voice firm. "You're staying as long as you need to." Penny's eyes widened, filled with a mixture of surprise and profound relief. "Caleb, I can't ask you to—" "You're not asking," he cut her off. "I'm telling you." He rose to his feet. "I'll get Silas to stable your horse, and I'll find some bandages. We need to get you seen by a doctor." He walked out of the room, leaving her in the quiet solace of the parlor. He found Silas outside, and the old man's face was a study in quiet concern. "That's Ilara's mother, isn't it?" Silas asked, his voice low. Cal nodded, his jaw tight. "She's hurt. Fell from her horse. She says it's a fall, but I don't know." He recounted the bruise on her ribs. Silas's brow furrowed. "That's a bad bruise, boss. Looks like she might have taken a blow to the side, not just a fall." Cal felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He shook his head. "Doesn't matter. She's staying. I'll take her to see Doc Jenkins tomorrow." He returned to the house to find Penny standing by the large wooden trunk in the corner of the parlor. It was Ilara's trunk, filled with old letters, trinkets, and a few of her favorite dresses. She was holding a small silver locket in her hands. "I found this in her things," she said, her voice trembling. "It was the locket her father gave me on our wedding day. Ilara always loved it. I thought she would have wanted you to have it." She handed him the locket. It was cool and heavy in his palm. He opened it, his thumb tracing the worn edges. Inside, there were two miniature portraits, one of a young, smiling Ilara, and the other of her, and her father, smiling broadly, a picture he'd never seen before. Cal felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief, the kind that steals your breath. He closed the locket, tucking it into his pocket. "Thank you," he managed to say, his voice thick with emotion. Penny looked at him, her eyes searching his. "Caleb, there's something you need to know." Her voice was a low whisper, full of urgency. "The truth about Ilara's death, it wasn't an accident." Cal's heart stopped. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He had been told she had died in a stagecoach accident, a tragic casualty of a runaway team. He had built his grief on that foundation. Now Penny's words shattered it into a million pieces. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "My ranch," she started, her eyes darting to the window as if a ghost were watching them. "It's gone. Taken by a man named Kane Rourke. He's a monster. He believes there's gold on our land. Ilara found out, and he silenced her. It wasn't an accident, Caleb, it was murder." The world went silent around Cal. The distant howl of the wind, the creak of the floorboards, the soft sigh of Penny's breathing, all faded into a distant hum. All he could hear was Penny's voice, the echo of her words ringing in his ears. Ilara's death wasn't an accident. It was murder. The cold dread that had been a passenger in his stomach all day now turned into a burning rage. A new, terrifying purpose had been born in the heart of the Blackwood Canyon Ranch. The rage that simmered in Cal's gut was a fire he hadn't felt in years. It was a clean, sharp anger that burned away the apathy and grief that had consumed him. It was a purpose, a new reason to exist. Ilara wasn't just gone, she was taken. And the man who took her, Kane, the serpent Rourke, was still out there, free. He stood by the window, staring out at the darkening landscape, the setting sun painting the sky in fiery hues. But all he saw was red. Penny sat in the armchair, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, watching him with a mixture of fear and sympathy. "He's a dangerous man, Caleb," she said, her voice trembling. "He has an army of men. They'll kill you if you go after them." Cal turned, his face a hard, grim mask. "Let them try." The words were a low growl, a promise whispered to the evening air. The peaceful, grieving rancher was gone. In his place was a man forged in the crucible of vengeance. He walked over to the gun rack on the wall and took down his Winchester rifle. He checked the action, the familiar weight of the weapon, a comforting presence in his hands. He felt alive again, but it was a life born of a terrible, consuming fury. Penny rose, her face pale. "Caleb, please. Vengeance won't bring her back." "No," he agreed, his voice a low monotone, "but it'll give her justice." He went to the small table by the fireplace and pulled out a map. He traced the rough outline of Penny's ranch, the Sterling homestead, and the surrounding land. It was a long ride, through treacherous territory, but he knew the land like the back of his hand. "He's after the gold," Penny said as if reading his mind. "He thinks my husband, your father-in-law, found a vein on the property. We never did. It was just a rumor, but Kane believes it, and he'll do anything to get his hands on it. He killed Ilara because she was getting too close to the truth. She found out what he was doing and was going to ride to town to report him." Cal's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. The image of Ilara, vibrant and full of life, riding to her death because of this monster, was unbearable. He needed help. Silas was a loyal hand, but he was a rancher, not a gunfighter. He needed someone who knew how to handle men like Kane Rourke. He needed Cody Ghost Miller. Cody was a bounty hunter, a man who lived in the shadows. He had been a friend to Cal for years, a rare man who understood his need for solitude and respected it. He was a man of few words, but every word was a promise. Cal had no idea where he was, but he had a feeling that Cody would find him, as he always did, when he was needed most. Cal put on his boots and his coat. "I'm riding out," he said, his voice flat. "Where are you going?" Penny asked, her voice laced with fear. "To find a man," Cal said, "and then I'm going to find Kane Rourke." He walked out of the house, the night air a sharp, cold sting against his skin. The silence of the ranch was now a roaring symphony of fury in his ears. He saddled his horse, grabbed his rifle, and set out into the night. He rode for hours, the moon his only guide, his mind a maelstrom of thoughts and emotions. He thought of Ilara, of her beautiful laugh, of the way her hand had felt in his, and then he thought of her death, and the rage would return, a tidal wave of fury washing away the sorrow. He rode until the first hint of dawn, when he saw a small campfire in the distance. He reined in his horse, his hand instinctively going to the rifle. As he drew closer, he saw a lone figure silhouetted against the firelight. The man was tall and lean, with long, dark hair and the quiet, watchful stillness of a predator. He was cleaning his revolver, the metal glinting in the firelight. It was Cody. Cal dismounted and walked toward the fire, the crunch of his boots on the dry earth a stark intrusion on the quiet morning. Cody didn't look up. "Took you long enough, Cal." His voice was a low rumble, devoid of surprise. "I knew you'd come. I felt it in my bones." Cal sat down on a log near the fire, his muscles aching with exhaustion. "How did you know?" Cody finally looked up, his dark eyes meeting Cal's. "I've been keeping an eye on things. Heard whispers about the Sterling Ranch, a new face named Kane Rourke. A lot of armed men. I had a feeling it was connected to your past." Cal's heart felt a flicker of warmth. Cody wasn't just a friend. He was a guardian, a quiet shadow watching over him. "Penny Sterling is at my ranch," Cal said, and he told Cody everything. The visit, the lie about the stagecoach accident, the truth about Kane Rourke and the gold. Cody listened, his face unreadable. When Cal was finished, he just nodded slowly. "So he killed her for something that doesn't even exist." "He killed her for the possibility of it," Cal corrected, his voice tight. "He's a monster, Cody. We have to stop him." Cody looked into the fire, his expression thoughtful. "We will," he said, his voice low and firm. "But we have to do it smart, Cal. We can't just ride in guns blazing. This is a big operation. We need to be careful. We need a plan." Cal nodded. The fire in his gut was still there, but now it was tempered by a cold, hard resolve. He was no longer just a grieving rancher. He was a man with a purpose, and with Cody by his side, he was ready to face the serpent that had stolen his future and his love. The ghost of vengeance had found its partner. The dawn broke over the Montana horizon, painting the sky in soft shades of rose and gold. But for Cal, the world was a harsh, unforgiving gray. He sat by the campfire, the locket Ilara's mother had given him clutched in his hand. The weight of it was a constant, solid reminder of the life he had lost and the vengeance he now sought. Cody was brewing coffee, the rich, earthy scent a welcome distraction from the heavy silence. He was a man of action, not words, and he knew that Cal needed to process the information, to let the rage settle into a cold, hard resolve. "Kane Rourke," Cody finally said, his voice low. "He's a snake. I've heard his name before. He and his men run a tight ship. They're ruthless. He's not just a man, he's an enterprise. They take what they want. They've been terrorizing small ranches in the area. The authorities are either too scared or too corrupt to do anything about it." Cal felt a sickening lurch in his stomach. The scale of the problem was much larger than he had imagined. This wasn't just about Ilara. This was about a monster terrorizing an entire region. "So, what's the plan?" Cal asked, his voice raw. Cody looked at him, his dark eyes unblinking. "First, we don't go back to your ranch. Kane is going to be looking for Penny. He knows she's the key to the gold. He'll send his men to find her. The ranch is the first place they'll look." A wave of dread washed over Cal. He had left Penny alone. What if they had already found her? What if he was too late? "We need to get her somewhere safe," Cal said, his voice urgent. "Now." Cody nodded. "There's a hidden cabin up in the hills. Belongs to an old trapper I know. He's been gone for years. It's a day's ride from here. No one knows about it. We'll take her there. She'll be safe." The plan was a good one, but it meant leaving the ranch, the place that was his only connection to Ilara. It meant becoming a fugitive, a shadow in the mountains. He looked at Cody, a man who had lived his whole life as a shadow, and felt a surge of respect. They rode for the ranch, a silent, grim mission. As they approached, they stayed off the main road, riding through the brush and trees, their senses on high alert. The stillness of the morning was broken only by the soft thud of their horses' hooves. They saw the first sign of trouble from a distance, a faint wisp of smoke rising from the chimney of Cal's house. It was a clear signal that someone was inside. Cal's hand instinctively went for his rifle. "Hold on," Cody whispered. "It could be Silas. Or it could be them." They dismounted and proceeded on foot, moving through the cover of the trees. They approached the house from the back, silent as ghosts. Cal's heart hammered against his ribs. He imagined Kane's men inside. Their rough hands on Penny, and a cold fury took over. As they neared the house, they heard the low rumble of voices. Not just one or two, but many. Cal's stomach dropped. It was them, Kane's men. He looked at Cody, who held up a hand, a silent command to stop. Cody gestured to the side of the house, where a back door stood ajar. They moved to the shadows, their eyes scanning the area. Cal saw a man with a scarred face, a long rifle in his hands, standing guard by the front porch. He was one of Cain's men, he knew it. The sight of him, standing on his land, was an unforgivable desecration. Cody moved first, a blur of motion. He was silent, a true ghost. He slid behind the scarred man and, with a swift, brutal motion, knocked him unconscious. The man crumpled to the ground without a sound. Cal was a good rancher and a competent fighter, but he was no match for Cody's silent, deadly skill. He felt a moment of profound gratitude for his friend. They slipped inside the house through the back door. The sound of voices was louder now, coming from the parlor. Cal and Cody crept down the hall, their movements light and silent. They peered around the corner into the parlor. There were 3 men, rough-looking and heavily armed, their rifles resting against the mantelpiece. They were laughing, their voices coarse and loud, their boots tracking mud across the rug that Ilara had made. And then Cal saw her. Penny was sitting in the armchair, a terrified look on her face, but with a spark of defiance in her eyes. One of the men was standing over her, his hand resting on the hilt of his pistol. Cal's blood ran cold. He was about to charge in, but Cody's hand shot out and gripped his arm, a silent command to wait. They were outnumbered. A direct assault was suicide. They needed a plan. Cody gestured to the kitchen, and then to the other end of the house. He was signaling that they should split up, create a diversion. Cal nodded, a silent agreement. He would go through the kitchen and come up behind them. Cody would go the other way, creating a distraction from the main entrance. They moved with practiced ease, their movements a silent, deadly ballet. Cal crept through the kitchen, the sight of a half-eaten meal on the table, a sign of their violation fueling his rage. He reached the other end of the parlor, his heart pounding in his chest. Cody burst through the front door, a ghost of a man with 2 pistols drawn, their barrels glinting in the morning light. "Drop your weapons," he roared, his voice a thunderclap in the silent room. The men in the parlor spun around, their hands going for their guns. Cal moved then, his rifle raised. He shot the lamp hanging from the ceiling, plunging the room into darkness. A split second later, 3 shots rang out, one after another, and the sound of bodies hitting the floor was the only thing left. When the dust settled and the light from the rising sun crept back into the room, 2 of the men lay dead on the floor. The third was a crumpled heap against the wall. Cody stood over them, his pistols still smoking. Penny was trembling in her chair, a hand over her mouth. Cal ran to her, a wave of relief washing over him so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice choked with emotion. She just nodded, her eyes wide with shock. Cody holstered his pistols. "We have to go, now, before the others get here." Cal nodded, the plan clear in his mind. He helped Penny to her feet, his hands gentle on her bruised ribs. They walked out of the house, leaving the dead men behind, and mounted their horses. The path to redemption had begun. The ride to the trapper's cabin was long and arduous. The sun beat down on them, and the trail was a series of rocky inclines and sharp descents. But Cal's mind was not on the physical exertion. He was acutely aware of Penny's presence, of her fragile state, and the responsibility he now bore. She was his link to Ilara, and he would not let her come to harm. Penny was quiet, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, as she rode between Cal and Cody. She was still in a state of shock, her mind reeling from the violence she had witnessed, and the knowledge that her own home was a fortress of death and greed. They rode through the heart of the Blackwood Canyon, a place Cal had once found peace. Now it was just a silent, brooding wilderness, a reminder of the darkness that had consumed his life. He watched Cody, who rode with the silent grace of a man who belonged in the wilderness. He was a man of contrasts, brutal and deadly when he needed to be, but with an underlying sense of honor and loyalty that was as solid as the mountains around them. As the sun began to set, they arrived at the cabin. It was small and rustic, tucked away in a small hidden clearing surrounded by tall pines. It looked like something out of a dream, a tiny, forgotten piece of a world that was still untouched by the violence of men. "This is it," Cody said, his voice low. "We'll be safe here." They dismounted, and Cal helped Penny off her horse. She winced in pain, and he held her for a moment, his arms around her, a silent promise of protection. She leaned into him, and for a fleeting moment he felt a sense of connection he hadn't experienced since Ilara's death. It was a fragile, tender thing, but it was there. Inside, the cabin was clean and well-maintained. It was clear that Cody had been here before, a hidden sanctuary for a man who lived a life on the run. There was a small fireplace, a bed with a warm blanket and a small table with 2 chairs. Cody built a fire, and the small room filled with the warm, comforting scent of burning pine. Cal helped Penny to the bed, and she sank onto it with a sigh of relief. "I'll get some water from the stream," Cody said, and he left them alone. Cal sat on the chair opposite the bed, watching Penny. The firelight flickered across her face, highlighting the lines of exhaustion and pain. "I'm so sorry, Caleb," she said, her voice a reedy whisper. "I brought this upon you." "No," he said, his voice firm. "You didn't. This was already here. I just didn't see it." He looked at the locket in his hand. "I should have known. I should have done something sooner." "You couldn't have known," she said, shaking her head. "No one could have. He's a master of deception." They fell into a comfortable silence, a silent communion of shared grief and a growing sense of shared purpose. He realized that Penny wasn't just Ilara's mother. She was a victim, a survivor, a woman who had lost everything, and he, in a way, was just like her. Cody returned with a bucket of water. He built a small fire outside and began to cook a simple meal of beans and bacon. The scent wafted into the cabin, a welcome smell that made Cal realize how hungry he was. As they ate, the silence was broken only by the crackling of the fire and the low, murmured conversation. They talked about the past, about Ilara, about the life she had lived, and the love she had shared with Cal. Penny's stories were a balm to his soul, a chance to remember the joy, not just the pain. "She always talked about you," Penny said, a soft smile on her lips. "She said you were the kindest, most decent man she had ever met. She said you were her rock, her foundation." Cal felt a lump form in his throat. He had failed to be that rock, that foundation. He had let his grief consume him. He had been a man of stone, not a man of flesh and blood. "I failed her," he said, the words a raw, painful confession. "No," Penny said, her eyes meeting his. "You didn't. You loved her. And you are here now, protecting me. That's all that matters." Her words were a gift, a ray of light in the darkness of his soul. He had been so focused on vengeance, on the raw, angry need to punish Kane Rourke. But now he saw a new purpose. It wasn't just about vengeance. It was about redemption. It was about honoring Ilara's memory by protecting the people she had loved, by fighting for a world she would have wanted. As he watched Penny fall asleep, exhausted but safe, he felt a flicker of something new. It wasn't love, not yet. But it was a tenderness, a quiet affection born of shared sorrow, and the dawning realization that he was not alone. The grieving rancher was beginning to heal, and the journey was just beginning. The morning sun crept through the cracks in the cabin walls, painting a mosaic of light on the wooden floor. Cal woke to the gentle crackling of the fireplace and the quiet rhythm of Penny's breathing. She was still asleep, her face serene in the soft light. He felt a quiet sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. He wasn't alone. He had Penny to protect and Cody to fight with. The world was no longer a bleak, endless landscape of grief, but a place with a clear, defined enemy and a purpose. He got up quietly, trying not to disturb Penny. He found Cody outside, sitting on a log, his rifle resting against his knee. He was whittling a small piece of wood, his movements precise and methodical. "She's still sleeping," Cal said, his voice low. Cody nodded without looking up. "She needs it. She's been through a lot." Cal sat down on the log next to him. He looked out at the vast, wild landscape, at the mountains that stood like silent sentinels. "I was a fool," he said, his voice a low rumble. "I let my grief consume me. I lost sight of everything." Cody finally looked at him, his dark eyes unwavering. "Grief is a tricky thing, Cal. It's a wound that never truly heals. You just learn to live with the scars, but you can't let it turn you into something you're not. Ilara wouldn't have wanted that." The words were a brutal, honest truth, and they landed with the force of a punch. Cal nodded slowly. "I know. It's just, I didn't know how to live without her. Everything was empty." "It's not empty anymore," Cody said, and he gestured toward the cabin. "You have a reason to fight now, a reason to live." Cal looked at the cabin, at the small wisp of smoke rising from the chimney. He thought of Penny, of her quiet strength, her raw vulnerability. She was a link to Ilara, a living, breathing testament to her memory. He wouldn't fail her. Not this time. He and Cody spent the morning in quiet communion, planning their next moves. They needed to find out more about Kane Rourke. They needed to know his strengths, his weaknesses, his habits. They couldn't just ride in blindly. This was a war, not a simple shootout, and they were outnumbered. "I have a contact in town," Cody said. "A saloon girl named Maeve. She's sharp and she hears things. She'll know what's going on with Rourke." "Town is a risk," Cal said. "He might have men looking for us." "He will," Cody agreed, "but we'll be careful. We'll go in at night, stay in the shadows, we'll get in and out before anyone knows we're there." The plan was audacious, but it was their only option. They needed information, and Maeve was their only lead. They waited until the afternoon, until Penny woke up. She was still pale and fragile, but there was a newfound resolve in her eyes. "We need to go to town," Cal explained. "We need to find out more about Rourke. We have a plan. We'll be back by dawn." Penny nodded, her gaze firm. "Be careful, Caleb. He's a man with no conscience. He won't hesitate to kill you." "I know," Cal said, "but he made a mistake. He came after the wrong people." They left Penny with a stack of firewood and a full bucket of water. She was safe for now. As they rode away, Cal looked back at the small cabin, a beacon of hope in the vast wilderness. The ride to town was a silent one, a journey of two men with a shared purpose. They arrived in the dusty, quiet streets of the small town of Hope Springs just as the sun was setting. The town was a typical Western outpost, a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon, and a few scattered houses. They tethered their horses in a back alley and moved through the shadows, their eyes scanning the street for any sign of trouble. They found the saloon, a loud, raucous place full of the smell of stale beer and cheap whiskey. They slipped in through the back, a ghost and a man on a mission. They found Maeve behind the bar, a striking woman with fiery red hair and a sharp, intelligent glint in her eyes. She saw Cody, and her face broke into a wide, welcoming smile. "Cody Miller," she said, her voice a low purr. "Haven't seen you in a while. What brings you to this dusty old town?" Cody just grunted, a familiar greeting between them. "We need information, Maeve, about a man named Kane Rourke." Maeve's smile faded. Her eyes darted to the side, a flicker of fear in them. "He's not a man to mess with, Cody. He's got this whole town in a stranglehold. The sheriff is on his payroll. Everyone is too scared to say anything." "That's why we came to you," Cal said, his voice low. Maeve looked at him, her eyes sizing him up. She saw the pain in his eyes, the hard, grim resolve. She saw a man who had nothing left to lose. "He's staying at the old hotel on the outskirts of town," she said, her voice a whisper. "He's looking for a woman, an old lady. She came with him to the Blackwood Ranch a few months ago. He said she knew where the gold was." Cal's heart pounded in his chest. He knew who she was talking about. Ilara's mother. The lie she had told him about the stagecoach accident was a terrible, painful truth. It was a lie to protect him from the very man he was now going after. The lie about her being with Kane, that was a lie to herself and to him. The reality was more complicated and more sinister than he could ever have imagined. He had to know the truth. He looked at Maeve, his gaze intense. "Did he say anything else about the woman? About what happened to her?" Maeve shook her head, her face pale. "No, just that she was gone. He was furious. He sent his men all over the place looking for her, but I heard a rumor. One of the men, a scrawny kid who was drinking one night, said something I couldn't forget." She leaned closer, her voice barely a whisper. "He said that Kane found her at a stagecoach stop, and that he had a fight with her. A violent one. He said that she fell and that she hit her head. He said that Kane thought she was dead. He left her there, but he had no idea she was alive." Cal's world tilted on its axis. So Ilara's death wasn't just a simple murder. It was a terrible, brutal accident that had been spun into a lie. He felt a wave of cold fury. Kane Rourke was not just a monster. He was a coward. A man who would leave a woman for dead and then hunt her down again just for the sake of gold. "Thank you, Maeve," Cal said, his voice low and tight. He dropped a few coins on the counter. "This is for you. Don't tell anyone we were here." Maeve looked at the money, then at him. "Be careful, boys," she said, her voice full of genuine concern. "You're walking into a lion's den." They left the saloon, the information a heavy weight in their minds. The town, once a symbol of the wild, untamed West, now felt like a cage, a place of violence and deception. The unspoken bond between Cal and Cody was now a chain forged in the fires of vengeance and a desperate need for justice. The path to redemption was getting darker and more dangerous with every step. Back on the dusty trail under the cold, indifferent gaze of the moon, Cal and Cody rode in silence. The information from Maeve had landed like a stone in a still pond, sending ripples of anger and cold resolve through them. The truth about Ilara's mother was more complex and terrifying than they had imagined. She hadn't been with Kane Rourke willingly, but as a hostage, a pawn in his brutal search for gold. Her fall and the subsequent belief that she was dead was a stroke of cruel irony. Kane Rourke, the monster, was also a fool, and that was a dangerous combination. "He's a man of habit," Cody said, breaking the silence. "He'll be at the old hotel. He'll have men guarding it, but he'll be inside, probably drinking, celebrating his victory. He thinks he's won. He thinks he's finally going to get that gold." Cal's jaw was tight. "He thinks he's won. He's wrong." They rode through the night, a silent, determined force. They reached the outskirts of the town and approached the old hotel. It was a large, dilapidated building, its windows dark and lifeless. A few lanterns hung from the porch, casting long, eerie shadows on the ground. Cal and Cody dismounted and moved into the shadows, their eyes scanning the area for any sign of guards. They saw two men sitting on the front porch, their rifles resting against their knees. They were laughing and talking, their voices loud and boisterous in the stillness of the night. They were arrogant, complacent, and completely unprepared for what was coming. Cal and Cody moved with the practiced ease of men who had done this 100 times. Cody, the ghost, slid through the shadows, a silent predator. He was behind the men in a flash, and with a swift, brutal motion, he disarmed them and knocked them unconscious. They crumpled to the ground, two silent, unmoving heaps. Cal and Cody entered the hotel through a side door. The air inside was thick with the smell of dust and old wood. The front desk was empty, the lobby a silent, forgotten place. They crept up the stairs, their footsteps silent on the creaking wood. They found Rourke's room on the second floor. A single lantern was burning in the room, casting a faint glow through the crack in the door. They could hear the low rumble of voices inside. Cody put a hand on Cal's arm, a silent command to stop. He knelt and peered through the keyhole. He saw Kane Rourke, a large, bull-necked man with a cruel smile on his face, sitting at a table with 3 other men. A bottle of whiskey and a deck of cards lay on the table. Rourke was laughing, his voice a harsh, grating sound. Cody drew his pistol and gestured to Cal. They would go in, guns blazing. It was a risky plan, but it was the only one they had. They were outnumbered, but they had the element of surprise. Cal took a deep breath, the cold resolve settling in his gut. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for, the moment of vengeance. Cody kicked the door open, and the sound echoed through the silent hotel. "Kane Rourke!" he roared, his voice a thunderclap. "It's over!" The men in the room jumped, their hands going for their guns. Rourke's cruel smile vanished, replaced by a look of pure, unadulterated shock. He hadn't expected them. He hadn't expected anyone to have the guts to come after him. Cody fired, and one of the men went down with a grunt. Cal fired a split second later, and another man fell. Rourke and the third man scrambled for their guns, but it was too late. Cody was a whirlwind of motion, his pistols a blur of steel and fire. The third man fell, and Rourke was left alone, his face pale with fear. He raised his hands in surrender, his eyes wide with terror. "Don't shoot," he stammered, his voice a high-pitched squeak. "I'll give you anything you want. The gold is not real. It was just a rumor. I'll give you everything I have." Cal just stared at him, his face a hard, grim mask. "The gold doesn't matter," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You took a life." Rourke's eyes darted between Cal and Cody, a look of desperate fear in them. "I didn't mean to. It was an accident. I didn't know she was Ilara's mother. I swear." "It doesn't matter," Cal said again, his voice colder than a winter wind. "You left a woman for dead. You took a life. You deserve to lose yours." Cody looked at Cal, a question in his eyes. He was a bounty hunter. He had killed men before. But this was different. This was personal. This was vengeance. Cal looked at Rourke, at the man who had stolen his love, his future, his life. He raised his pistol, his hand steady. Rourke was a monster, a man with no conscience, and he deserved to die. But then, an image flashed in his mind, the image of Penny, her face full of sorrow and strength, the image of Ilara, her beautiful smile, her kind eyes. He remembered Penny's words, "Vengeance won't bring her back." He lowered his pistol. his hand trembling slightly. Vengeance would not bring Alara back. It would only make him a killer, a man as cruel and as heartless as Rourke. "Get out," Cal said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Get out of this town, and if I ever see you again, I won't hesitate. I'll kill you. The gold is not here. Leave this town and never come back." Rourke scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of profound relief. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his hat and ran out of the room, leaving his men and his weapons behind. Cody looked at Cal, a flicker of respect in his eyes. "You did the right thing, Cal," he said. "You let him live. He'll never forget this. He'll live with the fear of you for the rest of his life." "That's a punishment worse than death." Cal just nodded, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He had faced his demon, and he had won, but the victory was bittersweet. The feeling of vengeance had been so strong, so intoxicating, but he had resisted. He had chosen a different path. He had chosen redemption. The desperate alliance had saved him from himself. The ride back to the cabin was a silent one, a journey of two men who had faced death and chosen life. The pre-dawn air was cold and crisp, and the sky was a canvas of deep indigo and nascent rose. Cal felt a strange mixture of relief and emptiness. He had faced Cain Rourke and won. He had avenged Ilara's death, not with a bullet, but with a promise of a future filled with fear for his enemy. It was a victory, but it was a quiet, internal one. He looked at Cody, who rode with his usual silent grace. He was a true friend, a man who had stood by him in his darkest hour. "Thank you, Cody," Cal said, his voice low and sincere. "I couldn't have done it without you." Cody just nodded, his dark eyes meeting Cal's in a shared understanding. "That's what friends are for, Cal. Besides, I needed the entertainment." A ghost of a smile touched Cal's lips. He felt a sense of camaraderie, a bond that was forged in the fire of shared purpose and a life of danger. They reached the cabin as the sun was rising. The sight of the small rustic building was a welcome one, a beacon of home in the vast wild landscape. They dismounted and entered the cabin. Penny was awake, sitting by the fireplace, a cup of tea in her hands. She looked at them, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and relief. "You're back," she whispered, her voice trembling. "We're back," Cal said, his voice a low rumble. "And it's over. Rourke is gone. He won't be back." Penny's eyes filled with tears, and she put her hands over her face, her shoulders shaking with silent sobs. Cal went to her and knelt by her side. He put a hand on her shoulder, a gentle, reassuring touch. "It's all right," he said, his voice soft. "It's all right now." Penny looked up, her face streaked with tears. "Thank you, Caleb, thank you. You saved me. You saved us all." "You saved me too," Cal confessed, the words a raw, honest confession. "You gave me a reason to live again, a reason to fight. You reminded me of who I was." The three of them sat in silence, the firelight casting a warm, comforting glow on their faces. The cabin was a sanctuary, a place of peace and safety. It was a home, not a house, and for the first time in 3 years, Cal felt like he was home. As the sun climbed higher, they talked. They talked about the future, about what they would do now. Penny's ranch was still in Rourke's hands, but they knew he wouldn't be back. They could go back, rebuild, reclaim what was rightfully theirs. "I'm going to stay with you, Caleb," Penny said, her voice firm. "I'm not leaving you. I'm going to help you rebuild your life. We can do it together. I can help you with the ranch. I know all about cattle and crops and all that." Cal looked at her, his heart full of a feeling he couldn't name. It was not love, not yet. But it was a tenderness, a quiet affection, a bond that had been forged in the fire of shared sorrow and a shared purpose. "We can go back to the Blackwood Ranch," Cal said. "We can rebuild it, not as a monument to grief, but as a monument to life, to a new beginning." Penny's face broke into a wide, beautiful smile. It was a smile that reminded him so much of Ilara, a smile that promised a future filled with hope and light. They spent the day in the cabin, resting, talking, and planning. They were no longer a grieving rancher, a bounty hunter, and a victim. They were a family, a small, desperate alliance that had found its purpose in the face of overwhelming odds. As the sun began to set, Cody rose to his feet. "I'm going to leave you two alone," he said, his voice low. "I have a few things to take care of." Cal knew what he meant. He was going back to his life as a bounty hunter, a shadow in the mountains. But he knew that their paths would cross again. "Thank you, Cody," Cal said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Cody just nodded, his dark eyes meeting Cal's in a silent goodbye. He walked out of the cabin, a silent ghost disappearing into the deepening twilight. Cal and Penny were alone. The silence was not an empty one, but a comforting, peaceful one. They were two broken people, standing at the precipice of a new life. They had faced their demons, and they had won. The path to redemption was long and winding, but for the first time in a long time, Cal felt a sense of hope, a sense of a future that was not defined by sorrow, but by a new beginning. The prodigal son had returned to his home, and he was not alone. The journey back to the Blackwood Canyon Ranch was a quiet, hopeful one. The sun was a warm, comforting presence on their skin, and the landscape, once a bleak and desolate wasteland, now seemed to be filled with life and promise. Cal and Penny rode side by side, their horses a silent testament to the new life they were about to build. As they neared the ranch, Cal's heart felt a strange mix of apprehension and anticipation. He hadn't been back since the confrontation with Kane Rourke's men. He didn't know what to expect. The dead bodies were still there, a grim reminder of the violence that had taken place. But he wasn't a man of sorrow anymore. He was a man of purpose. They rode into the ranch, and the stillness of the place was a strange, unsettling presence. They found Silas mending a fence post, his face a study in quiet concentration. He looked up, and his face broke into a wide, relieved smile. "Boss," he said, his voice full of genuine emotion. "You're back. We were worried sick about you." Cal dismounted and walked toward him. He looked at Silas, at the quiet strength in his face, and he felt a surge of gratitude. Silas had held the ranch together when he couldn't. He was a true friend. "It's over, Silas," Cal said. "Rourke is gone. He won't be back." Silas nodded, a look of profound relief on his face. "I heard a few whispers in town. A lot of Rourke's men were seen leaving in a hurry. The whole town is buzzing about it." "Good," Cal said. "Let them talk." He looked at Penny, and then back at Silas. "Silas, this is Penny Sterling. She's Ilara's mother." Silas's eyes widened, and he gave a polite nod. "Mum, it's an honor to meet you. Ilara talked about you a lot." Penny smiled, a warm, genuine smile. "It's an honor to meet you too, Silas. You're a good man. You stayed here in this place and you kept it safe. Thank you." Silas just nodded, a blush rising on his cheeks. He was a man of few words, but his face spoke volumes. Cal and Penny walked toward the house. The sight of it, once a hollow shell, now seemed to be a beacon of a new life. The door was still ajar, and the bodies of Rourke's men were still inside. Cal felt a brief pang of revulsion, but he pushed it aside. They would deal with it. They would clean the house. They would rebuild. They spent the rest of the day in a flurry of activity. Silas and a few of the ranch hands, a quiet, loyal bunch, helped them clean the house. They buried the bodies of Rourke's men in a quiet, unmarked grave on the edge of the property. It was a grim task, but it was a necessary one. They were closing a chapter and opening a new one. As the sun began to set, the house was clean and silent. The dust had been swept away, the furniture had been polished, and the memories, once a source of pain, were now a source of comfort. The air was filled with a sense of peace, a quiet hum of a new beginning. Cal and Penny sat on the front porch, watching the sunset, its fiery hues painting the sky in a beautiful, vibrant symphony of color. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. The silence was a language of its own, a language of shared sorrow, shared purpose, and a shared future. "It feels good to be home," Penny said, her voice a low whisper. "It does," Cal agreed. "It really does." He looked at her, at the strength in her face, at the resilience in her eyes. She was a survivor, a woman who had lost everything, but had not given up. He felt a deep sense of respect, a quiet admiration that was a new and unfamiliar feeling. He was no longer just a grieving rancher. He was a man who had faced his demons and won. He had chosen a new path, a path of redemption, of a new beginning. The whisper of a new life was just a whisper now, but he knew, with a certainty that was as solid as the mountains around them, that it would grow into a roaring symphony of hope. The grieving rancher was beginning to love again, not in the way he had loved Ilara, but in a new, quieter, more profound way. He was learning to live again, and in that he was honoring her memory more than any monument to his grief could have ever done. The end was just the beginning. The sun rose over the Blackwood Canyon Ranch, a brilliant golden promise of a new day. For Caleb Cal Blackwood, it was the first day of his new life, a life not defined by grief, but by a quiet, determined purpose. The ranch, once a place of silent sorrow, now hummed with a renewed energy. The old hands worked with a sense of shared purpose, their movements a testament to the new leadership they had found in Cal. Penelope, Penny Sterling, was a quiet, constant presence, her hands busy with the tasks of the house, her voice a soft, comforting murmur. She had a way of bringing order to chaos, of finding beauty in the mundane. She was a silent, powerful force of healing. She was also a reminder of his past, a living link to the woman he had loved and lost, but now that link was a source of strength, not of pain. Cal was a man reborn. He rode the trails with a renewed sense of purpose, his eyes scanning the horizon not for threats but for opportunities. He worked alongside his men, his hands calloused and strong, his back straight and unbowed. The weight of his grief had been replaced by the burden of a new life, a responsibility he welcomed with a quiet strength. One afternoon, as the sun was a low golden light on the horizon, Cal and Penny sat on the front porch, a silent, peaceful communion. The air was cool and crisp, and the sky was a canvas of fiery hues. "Caleb," Penny said, her voice a soft whisper, "thank you for everything, for giving me a home, for giving me a purpose." Cal looked at her, at the quiet strength in her eyes, and his heart felt a strange new warmth. "You gave me a home too, Penny," he said, his voice low, "and a purpose. I was lost. You found me." Penny smiled, a warm, genuine smile. "We found each other. We're a family, Caleb. A small, strange, broken family, but we're a family nonetheless." The words hung in the air, a profound truth. He had lost everything, but in the ashes of his grief, he had found something new, something unexpected. He had found a family. Their peace was shattered a few days later. A lone rider appeared on the horizon, a weary, familiar figure. It was Cody "Ghost" Miller, his face grim, his movements tense. Cal's heart sank. He knew, with a terrible certainty, that trouble had found them again. Cody dismounted and walked toward them, his eyes scanning the horizon, his hand resting on the hilt of his pistol. "He's back," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Kane Rourke, he's back." Cal felt a cold dread settle in his stomach. He had faced Rourke and had let him live, a decision he now questioned with a terrible regret. He should have killed him. He should have ended it. "I thought he'd be too scared to come back," Cal said, his voice tight. "He's a fool, not a coward," Cody said, a grim look on his face. "He's a man of greed. He won't rest until he gets what he wants." He looked at Penny, his gaze softening. "He's not just back for revenge, Penny. He's back for the gold. He thinks you've been lying to him. He thinks you've been leading him on a wild goose chase. He's going to find you, and he's going to make you talk." Penny's face was pale, but there was a flicker of defiance in her eyes. "He'll have to go through me first," she said, her voice firm. "He'll have to go through us all," Cal said, his voice a low growl. The peace of the ranch was shattered. The ghosts of the past, the specters of violence and greed had returned. The new life they had built, the fragile, beautiful thing they had created, was under threat. Cal knew with a terrible certainty that this time he would not hesitate. This time he would not let Rourke live. This time he would end it, once and for all. The burden of a new life had just become the burden of a final, bloody war. The air on the Blackwood Canyon Ranch crackled with a new, terrifying tension. The fragile peace they had built was gone, replaced by the grim reality of a war that had been thrust upon them. Kane, the serpent Rourke, was not a ghost, but a real, living, breathing monster, and he was coming for them. He had tasted defeat, and it had only fueled his greed and his desire for revenge. Cal, Cody, and Silas spent the next few days in a flurry of activity. They fortified the ranch, barricading the windows and doors, and turning the peaceful homestead into a fortress. They trained the ranch hands, a quiet, loyal bunch, on how to use their rifles. They were no longer just ranchers. They were soldiers. Penny was a quiet, constant presence, her hands busy with the tasks of the house, but her eyes a testament to the fear that gnawed at her. She moved with a silent grace, a woman who had been a victim of violence, but was now a part of the defense. She was a silent, powerful force of strength. One evening, as the sun was a deep, fiery orange on the horizon, they saw them, a small army of riders silhouetted against the setting sun. Kane Rourke was at the head of the group, his large, imposing figure a dark, menacing shadow. He had brought more men this time, a testament to his desperation and his rage. "It's him," Cal said, his voice a low growl. "It's time," Cody said, his voice a quiet, grim promise. Cal looked at Penny, and his heart clenched with a powerful, protective love. He had lost one woman to this monster. He would not lose another. "Get inside, Penny," he said, his voice firm. "Stay in the cellar. Don't come out until it's over." Penny looked at him, her eyes filled with fear, but she nodded. She knew what she had to do. She knew that her safety was their only chance. Cal and Cody stood on the front porch, their rifles in their hands, their eyes fixed on the approaching riders. Silas and the ranch hands were positioned behind them, their rifles at the ready. They were outnumbered, but they were not outmatched. They were fighting for their home, for their family, for their lives. Rourke's men surrounded the ranch, their movements a silent, predatory circle. Rourke himself rode to the front, his face a mask of cruel, triumphant glee. "Caleb Blackwood!" he roared, his voice a harsh, grating sound that echoed through the quiet canyon. "Come out. I know she's in there. Give her to me, give me the gold, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let you live." Cal looked at Cody, and they both knew that Rourke was lying. He would not let them live. He would burn the ranch to the ground, and he would kill them all. "The gold is not here, Rourke," Cal roared back, his voice a powerful, angry force. "And you're not getting her. Leave now, before it's too late." Rourke laughed, a harsh, grating sound that was filled with a terrible, cruel amusement. "Too late. I'll show you what too late looks like, Blackwood." He raised his hand, and his men began to fire, their rifles a deafening symphony of destruction. Bullets tore through the wooden walls of the house, shattering windows and splintering wood. The ranch was under siege. The war had begun. Cal and Cody fired back, their rifles a silent, deadly force. They were a ghost and a rancher, a quiet, deadly alliance against an army of greed and rage. They were outnumbered, but they were not outmatched. They were fighting for their home. They were fighting for their lives. The serpent had returned, and this time they would not let him get away. The air was thick with the acrid smell of gunpowder and the thunderous roar of gunfire. The Blackwood Canyon Ranch, once a peaceful sanctuary, was now a fortress under siege. The men fought with a grim, quiet determination, their faces a mask of weary resolve. Cal and Cody were a well-oiled machine, their movements a silent, deadly ballet. They were a ghost and a rancher, a force to be reckoned with. Kane Rourke's men were relentless, a constant, brutal pressure on their defenses. They fired from all sides, their bullets tearing through the wooden walls of the house, splintering the porch and sending splinters of wood flying through the air. The house was a living, breathing thing, groaning under the brutal assault. Cal and his men fired back, their rifles a constant, rhythmic beat against the roar of the attack. They were outnumbered, but they were holding their own. They were fighting for their home, for their family, for their lives. Inside the house, Penny Sterling was a silent, terrified presence. She was in the cellar, her hands clasped together, her eyes wide with fear. She could hear the thunderous roar of the gunfire, the splintering of wood, the low, angry shouts of the men. She was a woman of peace, a woman who had never known violence, but she was now a part of a war. She was a victim, a pawn in a brutal game of greed and revenge. But she was not alone. She had Cal. She had Cody. She had a family. As the sun began to set, the gunfire subsided, and a tense, terrifying silence descended on the ranch. Rourke's men had retreated, but they were not gone. They were just waiting, waiting for the darkness. Cal and Cody met in the living room, their faces grim, their clothes torn and stained with sweat and dirt. "They're going to try to burn us out," Cody said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "They're going to try to flush us out of the house. We have to be ready." Cal nodded, his face a hard, grim mask. He looked at the shattered windows, the bullet-riddled walls. The house was a mess, a testament to the brutal assault, but it was still standing. They were still standing. "We need a plan," Cal said. "We can't just wait for them to come back." Cody nodded, his eyes fixed on the darkening horizon. "We'll wait for the cover of darkness. We'll split up. We'll pick them off one by one. We'll show them that we're not just a fortress. We're a force to be reckoned with." The plan was audacious, but it was their only option. They had to take the fight to Rourke. They couldn't just wait for him to burn them out. As the last sliver of sun vanished below the horizon and the moon was a faint, ghostly presence in the sky, they moved. They were a ghost and a rancher, a silent, deadly force moving through the darkness. Cal and his men moved to the back of the house, their rifles at the ready. Cody moved to the front, a silent predator, his pistols drawn. The night was filled with a terrifying stillness. The only sound was the low, hushed whisper of the wind through the trees. They waited, their senses on high alert, their hearts pounding in their chests. And then they saw them. Small, shadowy figures moving through the darkness, carrying torches. Rourke's men. They were going to try to burn them out. "Now!" Cal roared, and the night was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. The battle was brutal, a chaotic symphony of fire and steel. They were outnumbered, but they were fighting with a fury born of desperation. They were fighting for their home. They were fighting for their family. They were fighting for their lives. The torches went out, one by one. The shadows fell one by one. The silent, deadly dance continued, a grim ballet of vengeance and survival. The fortress was holding, but the war was far from over. The night was an unrelenting storm of fire and steel. The ranch was a battleground, the air thick with the smell of gunpowder and the thunderous roar of gunfire. Cal and his men fought with a fierce, quiet determination, their faces grim, their movements precise and deadly. They were a small, outnumbered force, but they were a force to be reckoned with. They were a ghost and a rancher, a desperate alliance forged in the fires of vengeance and survival. Kane Rourke's men were relentless, a constant, brutal pressure on their defenses. They fired from all sides, their bullets a constant rhythmic beat against the walls of the house. The ranch was a living, breathing thing, groaning under the brutal assault. But it was still standing. They were still standing. Inside the house, Penny Sterling was a silent, terrified presence. She was still in the cellar, her hands clasped together, her eyes wide with fear. She could hear the thunderous roar of the gunfire, the splintering of wood, the low, angry shouts of the men. She was a woman of peace, a woman who had never known violence, but she was now a part of a war. She was a victim, a pawn in a brutal game of greed and revenge. But she was not alone. She had Cal. She had Cody. She had a family. As the night wore on, the fighting grew more intense. Rourke was a man consumed by rage and greed, and he would not stop until he had what he wanted. He was a serpent, and he was coiled around them, tightening his grip with every passing moment. Cal and Cody were a blur of motion, their rifles and pistols a constant deadly force. They were a ghost and a rancher, a quiet, deadly alliance against an army of greed and rage. They were outnumbered, but they were not outmatched. They were fighting for their home. They were fighting for their family. They were fighting for their lives. Then Rourke's men changed tactics. They stopped firing, and a tense, terrifying silence descended on the ranch. Cal and Cody knew what was coming. They were going to try to get inside. Cal and Cody and their men were ready. They were hidden in the shadows, their rifles at the ready. They were waiting for the final assault. They saw them, shadows moving through the darkness, their movements silent and swift. They were trying to get to the back door, to the cellar door. They were trying to get to Penny. "Now!" Cal roared, and the night was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. The battle was brutal, a chaotic symphony of fire and steel. They were outnumbered, but they were fighting with a fury born of desperation. They were fighting for their home. They were fighting for their family. They were fighting for their lives. Then a sudden sharp pain in Cal's side. He staggered, a gasp escaping his lips. He looked down and saw a dark red stain spreading across his shirt. He had been hit. He fell to his knees, his rifle slipping from his hands. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. He looked up and saw Cody, his face grim, his eyes filled with a terrifying, protective fury. Cody moved, a blur of motion, his pistols a constant, deadly force. He was a whirlwind of vengeance, a man who would not let his friend die. Cal's world was a blur of pain and noise. He could hear the roar of gunfire, the angry shouts of the men. He could feel the ground, cold and hard, against his hands. He was dying. He was losing the fight. Then, a sudden, blinding flash of light. A loud, sharp crack, and then silence. A profound, terrifying silence. Cal looked up, his vision blurry. He saw Cody standing over him, his pistols smoking. He saw the bodies of Rourke's men, a crumpled heap against the wall. And then, he saw Rourke. He was on his knees, his hands in the air, a look of desperate, terrified fear on his face. "Don't shoot!" he screamed. his voice a high-pitched squeal. "I surrender! I surrender!" Cal looked at him, at the man who had stolen his love, his future, his life. He looked at Cody, who was a ghost, a silent, deadly force of nature. He looked at the ranch, at the home they had fought so hard to protect. And he looked at Penny, her face pale with fear, but her eyes filled with a fierce, protective love. He had won. He had faced his demon, and he had won. But the victory was bittersweet. He was dying. The unrelenting storm had finally broken. The silence was a profound, terrifying thing. The battle was over. The storm had passed. The ranch, once a peaceful sanctuary, was now a battlefield, a place of death and destruction. But it was their home, and they had won. Cal lay on the ground, his lifeblood seeping into the cold, hard earth. He could feel the pain, a sharp, white-hot agony in his side. He looked up at Cody, who was a grim, silent presence, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and a terrible, cold rage. "It's over, Cal," Cody said, his voice a low, grim whisper. "We won." Cal just nodded, a gasp escaping his lips. He looked at Kane Rourke, who was on his knees, his face a mask of desperate, terrified fear. The serpent was defeated. The monster was a coward. Cody walked toward Rourke, his movements slow and deliberate. He raised his pistol, his face a grim, unyielding mask. He was a ghost, a silent, deadly force of nature, and he was about to do what he did best. He was about to end a life. "Don't!" a voice screamed. It was Penny. She had come out of the cellar, her face pale with fear, her eyes wide with a terrible, desperate plea. "Don't, Cody! Don't do it!" Cody stopped, his hand still. He looked at Penny, his face a grim study in confusion. "He killed her, Penny," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl. "He tried to kill Cal. He deserves to die." "No," Penny said, her voice a reedy whisper. "No, he doesn't. Not like this. Don't let him turn you into a killer, Cody. Don't let him turn you into something you're not." Cody looked at her, at the raw, desperate plea in her eyes. He looked at Cal, who was a crumpled heap on the ground, his lifeblood seeping into the earth. He looked at Rourke, a man who was a monster, a man who deserved to die. He lowered his pistol, his hand trembling slightly. He had been a killer his whole life. He had lived in the shadows. He had taken lives. But this was different. This was personal. This was vengeance. And Penny was right. Vengeance would not bring Alara back. It would only turn him into a killer. It would only make him a monster, just like Rourke. He turned to Rourke, a cold, unyielding look on his face. "Get out," he said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Get out of here, and if I ever see you again I won't hesitate. I'll kill you. Now, go!" Rourke scrambled to his feet, his face a mask of profound relief. He didn't hesitate. He grabbed his hat and ran into the darkness, a coward, a monster, a man who had escaped death. Cody turned to Cal, his face a grim mask. "We need to get him to the doctor," he said, his voice urgent. "Now. He's bleeding bad." Penny ran to Cal, her hands trembling as she knelt beside him. She looked at the dark, red stain spreading across his shirt, and her face was a mask of fear. "We have to stop the bleeding," she said, her voice a low whisper. "We have to stop the bleeding." She tore a strip of fabric from her dress and pressed it against his wound, her hands trembling, but her movements precise and determined. She was a woman of peace, a woman who had never known violence, but she was now a part of the healing. She was a woman of strength. They got Cal on a horse, a slow, painful process. He was weak, his vision blurry, his mind a haze of pain and fear. They rode through the night, a slow, silent procession. The journey was a long, brutal one, but they were determined. They would not let him die. Not now. Not after all they had been through. As the sun began to rise, they arrived in town. The doctor was an old, grizzled man with a kind face and a calm, steady hand. He took one look at Cal, and his face was a grim study in concern. "He's been hit bad," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We have to get this bullet out. It's deep." Cal was in and out of consciousness, his world a blur of pain and fear. He could hear the low murmur of voices, the sharp, cold sting of a needle. He could feel the doctor's hands, a quiet, steady presence. He was dying. He was losing the fight. But then he felt a soft hand on his face. He opened his eyes, and he saw Penny. She was sitting by his side, her hand on his cheek, her eyes filled with a fierce, protective love. "You're not going to die, Caleb," she said, her voice a low whisper. "Not now. Not after all we've been through. You're going to live. You're going to live." The words were a balm to his soul, a promise whispered to the heavens. He closed his eyes, and he felt a new, quiet sense of peace. He had faced his demon, and he had won. The price of vengeance was a life, but he had chosen a different path. He had chosen life. He had chosen to live. The price of vengeance was a life, but he had paid it with his own blood, and he had survived. Months passed, and the Blackwood Canyon Ranch was a place reborn. Caleb Cal Blackwood, a man who had been on the brink of death, was now a man on the cusp of a new life. He was still weak, his side a constant, aching reminder of the battle he had fought. But he was alive. And he was not alone. Penny Sterling was a quiet, constant presence, her hands busy with the tasks of the house, her voice a soft, comforting murmur. She was a healer, a woman who had found her purpose in the aftermath of a terrible storm. She was a mother, a friend, a partner in a new, fragile life. Cal and Penny's relationship was a quiet, tender thing, a bond forged in the fires of shared sorrow and a shared purpose. It was not a love born of passion, but a love born of respect, of admiration, of a shared understanding of what it meant to lose everything and to find a new beginning. They spent their days rebuilding the ranch, a silent, powerful testament to the new life they were building. The house was no longer a monument to grief, but a monument to life. The ranch was no longer a place of sorrow, but a place of hope. One evening, as the sun was a low golden light on the horizon, Cal and Penny sat on the front porch, their hands clasped together, a silent, peaceful communion. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" Penny said, her voice a low whisper. "The new life, the new beginning. It's beautiful." "It is," Cal agreed, his voice a low rumble. "It is, and it's all thanks to you." Penny smiled, a warm, genuine smile. "We found each other, Caleb. We're a family, a small, strange, broken family. But we're a family nonetheless." The words hung in the air, a profound truth. He had lost everything, but in the ashes of his grief, he had found something new, something unexpected. He had found a family. Cody Ghost Miller was a rare visitor, a silent, watchful presence who would appear on the horizon, a phantom on a horse and then disappear just as quickly. He was a ghost, a man who lived in the shadows, but he was a part of their family. He was a guardian, a silent, powerful force of protection. The Blackwood Canyon Ranch was a new frontier, a place of peace, of hope, of a new beginning. The grieving rancher had refused to love again, but in the ashes of his grief, he had found a new, quiet love, a love born of a shared journey, of a shared purpose, of a shared understanding of what it meant to lose everything and to find a new life. The story was over. The war was won. The grieving rancher was no longer grieving. He was living. And in that, he was honoring Ilara's memory more than any monument to his grief could have ever done. The new frontier was a place of hope, of a new beginning, a place where the sun rose every morning, a brilliant golden promise of a new day. The end was just the beginning.